Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible but were afraid to ask. I'm Katie Langston.
And I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker. And today we have as our special guest Dr. Love Sechrest, who is the Associate Provost and Professor of Theology at Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland. This is the second of a two-part series that we are talking with Dr. Sechrest about. And I should just remind you again, as I did in the first session, that Dr. Sechrest's recent book is called Race and Rhyme, Rereading the New Testament, published in 2022 from Erdman's Publishers. So, Love, thank you so much for joining us again for this important topic.
It is so good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
So the question that we're addressing, and again, this is part two of a two-part series. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to part one, you might want to do that. But the question that we got from a reader is this: from a listener. What does Jesus say about race and ethnicity? So let's maybe start, Love, if you wouldn't mind just recapping just a little bit of what you said in part one for those who haven't had a chance to listen to it.
Yeah, thanks. It's such an important question.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I talked about in the first podcast was the fact that while race does not appear in the New Testament in exactly the same ways as we're accustomed to thinking about it today, there are analogous concepts that did exist in the ancient world and in the Bible. For instance, one of the most common words in the New Testament is the Greek word ethnos, which is translated most often in our Bibles as Gentile, right? Now, ethnos is really the Greek word from which we derive the modern English, ethnicity, right? So right there, you can see there's a touch point. There's another word in the Greek, genos, which is one common translation is race. Sort of the basic idea in that is a kind of people group. Yeah. And so using that, you can look at the New Testament and find that there's all kinds of places where the New Testament is talking about conflict between people groups, like Jews and Gentiles, Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and Pharisees and Sadducees. And so it becomes a way of seeing analogs between contemporary life and the life during the time of Jesus. And that has been a dominant lens for me in terms of rereading the New Testament, to see what the New Testament might have to say about racial and ethnic conflict today by reading it, by looking at the group conflict, and to see what we can find that might be helpful for thinking about today.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So it's part of human nature, it seems, both in the ancient world and today, to have to separate into groups, right? Like the us and them kind of, or we and them. Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, that often leads to conflict or is part of conflict.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. One of the things that I introduced in the book is that as strong as the analogies may be, right, as we've kind of just recently talked about, it's also important to examine the differences, right? Because we might end up overlooking important dynamics in the contemporary world that aren't addressed in the Bible. And I think we need to try to cultivate a biblical imagination to first identify those differences, and then to try to figure out, well, are there other places in the Bible that might talk about the gap that we may see, right? Because they are very, very different contexts. Likewise, there may be issues in the biblical text that aren't strictly, sort of addressed in the contemporary world. So it's as important to think about the differences as it is to think about the similarities. And I actually see some tensions in the Gospel of Matthew, which is, I think, what we're going to talk about today. There are actually sometimes in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus says things that are really quite narrow, right? Like go nowhere among the Gentiles.
Right.
when he's sending
Right.
when he's sending the disciples out in Matthew chapter 10, it's called the missionary discourse, right? Like he says, don't go nowhere among the Gentiles. So that's one part. But then on the opposite pole, you have Matthew 28, the Great Commission, right? Go to all nations, teaching them everything that I have commanded you. So it's one of the reasons why I was really especially drawn to the Gospel of Matthew, because you see really a complexity in terms of some of the group interactions, and I think that complexity is helpful for thinking about the problems that beset us today.
Yeah. So before we dive into the Gospel of Matthew, I was curious by you were talking about some of the differences. So we talked. It sounds like, and forgive me that I wasn't there on the first call. I'm so excited and happy to be able to be here today. That there were, that we talked about the similarities and so on, but that there are some important differences. And I'd love if we could tease that out a little bit. What, for example, what kinds of differences?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. It is important to reiterate that here. So while the major constructs do separate, do identify particular people groups and to talk about what they have in common, and that is very similar to group identity, today. One of the major differences is that among the Greco-Roman world, the primary way of differentiating people groups had to do with homeland, place of origin. Yeah. And in some ways, this is like a similarity with today, right? African Americans, right? Like Anglo Americans who are coming from England, right? Or Italian Americans or German Americans, etc. And so this idea of associating sort of a group identity with a homeland or nationality finds similarity in the ancient Greek world. Jews, on the other hand, while they had, some of that, the thing that emerges as the major concern for them was religion, right? The biggest division among the Jewish people and the Israelite people of the early Christian period is who you worship. Do you worship the God of Abraham, or are you worshiping some other God? That becomes the dominant way of othering, right? Of understanding who we are over and against who the other is. Thanks for asking. That was such an important question.
Yeah.
One other difference that I think is probably worth noting that you mentioned in the first session, it has to do with skin color. Can you say a bit more about that difference?
So the dominant way of thinking about race today is with reference to skin color. Right. I think in the U.S. context, the differences between white and black and how other people groups get sorted, in that dichotomy has been, I think, really the besetting problem in the U.S. And it's cut across like ethnicity, even because people from African nations are constructed as black, even though they have very different social contexts from African American. Likewise, Caribbean people who are dark skinned from the Caribbean, they get sucked in, even against their will, into the dichotomies of black and white in the U.S. I don't want to oversimplify. I mean, there are lots of other people groups, Asian American, which is a group that none of them really recognizes as defining their group. They think of themselves as Chinese Americans or Japanese Americans or Korean Americans, etc. But
Asia's a big continent, it turns out, right? I said Asia's a big continent. It's
hello.
It's not like
exactly.
It's not a monoculture. Same with Africa and all the cultures, but
exactly. And so many of those people groups would like to resist sort of a simple dichotomy between black and white. And I think it's important to understand. But I think what I would say is that today we racialize lots of different people groups, right? That they are, and the ways that they are racialized differ. Now they they may be set over and against white, right? Is something that they have in common. But their individual experiences as people is very different from African Americans or Latinx Americans, etc. I would even say that white people are also racialized in the United States, right? Like they have lost their particularity as Italian immigrants or Jewish people or German immigrants, etc. And they get sort of collapsed into a racial category of white people and things that quote white people do, right?
Right.
So that's a very different context for thinking about racial and ethnic belonging here than was true in the ancient world. Now they had other complexities that I think one I was just reading about recently. I'm reading a wonderful book that talks about how language plays a important part of constructing identity in the ancient world and today. And so there are lots of different ways that the groups have thought about themselves and thought about what makes them distinctive. But those are some of the similarities and differences between the time of Jesus and today.
Cool. That's really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, that is really helpful. Thank you. Well, let's dive into the book of Matthew since we want to focus on particular texts. So, where would you like to start the conversation?
Yeah, I think I want to start with Matthew 15 and then compare it with Matthew 8.
Okay.
These are two stories that are really similar, but let's start with the one where Jesus encounters a Canaanite woman in Matthew 15:21. And it's when reading this story against the backdrop of our sort of contemporary fraught our ethnic and racial relations, it can be really troubling, right? I mean,
yeah, for sure.
really, really troubling.
This is one I struggle with. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's a terrible one. Jesus, a woman comes out, Lord, son of David, my daughter's tormented by a demon. First he ignores her. Then then his disciples say, send her away. She's bothering us. And then he says, this is very similar to another moment in the gospel we just talked about in the missionary discourse. He says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Right? Oh my gosh, how exclusive does that seem? And it's one of these moments that I say shows that there's some ambiguity in the Gospel of Matthew. And I do have some thoughts on that. If you're interested in more on that, please read my book.
All right.
We talk about
a teaser.
It's a little teaser, right? But still, this is really difficult. And then she continues to beg him, right? She drops at his feet, Lord, help me. But he says, verse 26, it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs.
Ouch.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Effectively calling her a dog. Now, our commentaries struggle with this part of the text. I mean, some have said, oh, well, he uses a diminutive word, so it's really like calling her a puppy versus calling her a dog. And I say, yeah, not helpful.
I don't know that
that's
helps.
not better. I mean, puppies are really cute, but we don't call people dogs or puppies.
Right?
It is like by definition. Yes,
it is dehumanizing.
Yeah.
I think as I have scoured sort of the Gospel of Matthew, there's another part of Matthew. Let me see if I can get to it real quick. It's a line in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7, verse 6. Do not give what is holy to dogs.
Oh, right.
And do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you. And as I looked at the sort of dog imagery and swine or pig imagery in New Testament and other early Jewish writings, really those are images for Gentiles. right? And so it's kind of interesting. Read in that light, this becomes an echo of what Jesus has said to this Canaanite, right? I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Like, I'm not going to give what's holy to Gentiles. I'm not going to throw my pearls in front of unclean, right? The unclean people, like Gentiles.
Right.
So I think that that's what's going on. In other words, this text has a lot of ethnic tension in it. And it's concerning the sort of the dominant tension that that Jesus, as a Jewish person, really Matthew, the evangelist, because all we have is what he's recorded of Jesus's words.
Right.
And frankly, I have to tell you, I have over the years and trying to engage this text over and over, and one of the most helpful things that for me has been to separate Jesus from Matthew, right? To say, yeah, well, Matthew certainly had some difficulties with Gentiles, but the Jesus tradition shows that in being faithful to what Jesus taught and preached, that the disciples ended up taking the gospel to the Gentiles, right? So there was something
was in there. Something was in there, right?
That's right.
The leaven and the loaf. Yeah,
there's something there. That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. There, it bore fruit. It bore fruit later, but nevertheless, the text in Matthew 15:21 is really difficult. And then she agrees. Yes, Lord, but even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. And then Jesus says, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And so, and her daughter was healed instantly. So he recognizes that she has, first she has acknowledged his status as Messiah, Lord, Son of David.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. And she's a Canaanite.
Right.
So there's some reward given to her because she has sort of identified her willingness to self-identify in the premier category for ancient Jews, which is worship of the God of Abraham, which or God's Messiah, right? Or God's Messiah. So that's sort of how she comes in to the group through in this interaction. But there's some of the differences that we could explore in this text that sort of bear thinking about, and that is sort of like Jesus calls, or Matthew calls the woman a Canaanite from the beginning. Whereas a similar story in the Gospel of Mark identifies her Syrophoenician, right? Which, and I don't know, if you were to be, which do you think would be better to be in biblical times, a Syrophoenician or a Canaanite? Which one do you think would register more friendly, say?
Well, Canaanite always is a negative, right? In the Old Testament, and it's not a common term, is it? I mean, does it occur anywhere else in this gospel?
I never. That's a great question. I don't think I've ever looked at it, but certainly you're right. It is freighted. It sort of brings back all of the old wars, right? All of the old fighting, all of that intergroup hostility and conflict that happened for centuries leading up to this point in time. So it's really interesting that he talks about her that way. And I think in my essay on this chapter, it shows to me that sort of what this encounter represents is an encounter across long-standing, very troubled intergroup relationships. Really kind of like the 400 years of slavery on the part of African Americans in the United States, followed by another 100 years of legal discrimination and segregation, right? Like long-standing, fraught relationships. And so it sort of demonstrates a kind of similarity. Now, before I talk more about it, I want to kind of switch and compare this episode to a really similar one in Matthew chapter 8. And this is the encounter between Jesus and the centurion. And what's really interesting about this is that in both cases, you have one person encountering Jesus, begging him for healing on the part of a youngin, a child that is associated with them closely. So the woman, it's her young daughter, and for the centurion, he's called my servant, my male servant. A lot of questions in the scholarly literature about what the best way is of understanding this relationship, but clearly someone the centurion cares about quite a lot.
Mhm.
They're both Gentiles. There are three encounters between Jesus and Gentiles in the Gospel of Matthew. So these are two out of those three. And matter of fact, the third one is further on in Matthew chapter 8. But so in both cases, Jesus is encountering a Gentile who is asking him for healing on behalf of someone else, someone who's sort of off stage. And in both cases, the way that Jesus encounters them is so I guess it's not the same as the wide welcome to all of the Jewish people that you see elsewhere in the gospel. Um, but in both cases, the petitioner really humbles themselves quite a lot,
Yeah.
right, to Jesus. The centurion says in verse 8, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. Only speak the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and the slave does it. And then Jesus, when he hears them, he's amazed and said, I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. I'll tell you, many will come from east and west and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So, like in both cases, they are complimented for the nature of their faith as outsiders. But I think it's interesting to kind of look at the differences between these two stories. There are a lot of similarities, but there's some pretty striking differences. The gender one is an obvious one.
Yeah, right. Sure.
The gender one. Another one is the difference between like sort of the nationalities. On the one, a Canaanite, where there's just a fraught relationship back and forth forever, right?
Yes.
Who's on top? Well, it varies. Like
Right,
depends
right.
on what decade you want to put your pen down in the timeline. But when it comes to the Gospel of Matthew, it was written as the smoke was still going up in the aftermath of the war with Rome. So Israel had just been defeated militarily by Romans.
And the temple destroyed.
And the temple destroyed.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. So here we have a very recent, but still a hot conflict,
Yeah.
right. Between Jesus and the other. But in both cases, So that I think is a very interesting contrast with the woman in the Canaanite woman. And as I reflect on these differences, it occurs to me that that Jesus is modeling, or what can emerge from this, and from thinking about how the Gospel of Matthew talks about the other and engages the other, is it sort of becomes a theology of allyship. Like in the contemporary world, we are really striving to find ways to create coalitions for justice, coalitions for peace, coalitions for love, peace. So people gathered under the name of Christ who advocate for the best for the other, as well as their own self-interest, right? And it seems to me that, like, thinking about how Jesus varied in his different comportment with a more recent kind of enemy, as in the centurion, he's much more respectful, right? The hostility doesn't come out quite as quickly, right? And the comportment with this Canaanite woman, right, where the hostilities are very long-standing. I think there's some theological reflection we can do in terms of understanding some of the dynamics of allyships, and kind of can manage our expectations about the difficulties of creating alliances with people groups who are different from ourselves. Anyway, I've been talking a lot, and this is why I think that the contrast between these two episodes, and thinking about the racial dynamics and the complexities that we have today, right? It's not just alliances between blacks and whites, but how do other people groups connect? And I kind of think of the centurion as representing he is speaking with Jesus, and he's trying to help someone not like himself, right? Like we don't know what this child was. It probably not his offspring,
Right.
but advocating for someone else off stage, right? Like that's an interesting thing to reflect on, building a theology of allyship, but being humble in terms of regarding the other, and so Jesus himself is not the dominant people group in this time frame, right? The Jews were defeated,
Right.
so he does not represent a conqueror himself.
Right.
Jesus is a minoritized.
Right.
He has a minoritized kind of identity in both in the whole Gospel of Matthew, and all of these Gospels, really, to one extent or another. So like the humility of not wanting to speak for someone else, another people group, but I'm trying to enter into and hear from, what their experience is, and to, call out what's remarkable. Oh, wow, this is not like what I've encountered at home.
Mm.
This is very different. And there's something really special about what I'm seeing in front of me.
So can let me ask a clarifying question. Uh, and I love where you're going with this, right? This idea of allyship and the complexity of it, right? It's really complex. In these two stories, is the is it the Gentiles that are the allies, or vice versa? Is Jesus that, or is it different for both?
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is that all of the people, with perhaps the exception of so if you're saying I'm a white person, and I understand sort of where I stand in contemporary race relations, right?
Mhm.
I know what assets I have at my fingertips, and I know that others don't have them, right?
Right.
So if I want to read myself into the story, where should I read myself? I think that like
Sure.
that's a question that I used to engage with my students all the time, because I think most of us. So I used to say this to my students in reading the story of the Canaanite woman. With whom do you identify
Mhm.
in this
Mhm. Mhm.
picture, right? And
Mhm.
white students, pretty much Jesus, right? Like
Mm.
he is and many oppressed students from oppressed communities would really bristle at the treatment of the Canaanite woman, because they could kind of read themselves
Yeah.
into that, that kind of posture.
Yeah.
But that, I think, is troubling.
Yeah.
So because historically, Jesus himself was a conquered people.
Yeah,
Right.
right,
Right.
right.
He didn't have a lot of power. He wasn't a super powerful
He was
person.
killed by the Romans. Hello.
Right. Right.
Like
Right.
Right.
he was executed, taken into custody and executed by the Romans. Yeah. Now, am I saying that white people are like Romans? Well,
No.
there are
Right.
similarities, but there are differences. So it's not. It's. Let's not be too quick to
Sure.
over-identify any one of these people groups with contemporary people groups, because there are going to be similarities and differences all the way around. But what I am trying to show is that these two texts present a rich multiplicity
Huh.
of people groups. We have a Jew interacting with a Roman, interacting with a Canaanite,
Mhm.
and I just thought that the complexities in all of those are worth reflecting on, and as Jesus is set up as the hero in all of these stories, he models for us, right, like the way that love for the other is shown. So one thing I think, for instance, there's a real difference between how Jesus he's much more respectful and deferential to the Roman than to
Right.
the Canaanite, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
I kind of go back to that little saying from the Sermon on the Mount. How does it go again? Let me see if I can find
Don't
it.
cast holy things before the
Put
dogs.
what's holy before to dogs.
Right.
Don't throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and
Mm.
turn and maul you. right? It's that wariness about being trampled. Yeah,
Mm.
that I see going on with the Roman, right? Is a wariness about being trampled. So Jesus keeps his dignity, but he's not gonna jump into a relationship until the other has humbled himself and said, yeah, this Roman has says, I have all the power here, but I'm going to take that off
Because I
and
need your
show
help.
that, humble myself to Jesus, who is the defeated other in my, context. So that's that. Those are the kinds of reflection that I want to try to understand by, as we put ourselves into the stories against some of the complexity. So for instance, when Jesus and the Canaanite interact, we have two minoritized groups, right, interacting with each other, and I wonder if there isn't something that minoritized groups, as they seek to build alliances for justice across some differences they may have had as well, that there may be something in terms of constructing a theology of allyship from there as well. That it's hard to go across long-standing differences, and it really does take a patience and a willingness to not disengage at the first sign of difficulty.
The woman shows tenacity, right? The Canaanite woman. And thank you for answering my too simplistic question with to complexify that. That was really helpful. I mean, it takes humility. I've heard that word a lot, in both stories. It takes tenacity. And I wonder, I've heard a lot of interpreters say, well, the Canaanite woman teaches Jesus something, right? Maybe it takes an openness to having one's mind changed as well.
Yeah, that's right. To being taught, right?
Even as
the Messiah, God's Messiah, right? That Jesus learns from this encounter and demonstrates a greater openness to the other, sort of in the back half of the gospel, all the way to the climax of the Great Commission. I do want to say, though, that even the Great Commission is interesting, because in no case does Jesus abandon his ethnic identity. Right? What does the Great Commission say?
All right, so I've got it. Matthew 28. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age.
Yeah. So some scholars have seen that this can be seen as analogous to a colonial impulse, right? Like to take my teaching and impose it on all nations, right? That can be, and I think, here's what I want to say. Well, I don't know if that, like Jesus was the conquered, not the conqueror. And so I don't know that from within the world created by the Gospel of Matthew, that the conquest idea makes sense. But certainly conquerors since then have
used it. They've used it in that way. Right.
Have used this text and misused this text, and created all kinds of havoc with other people groups in the name of Christ, in horrible ways. Conquest. So that's one similarity and difference, right? That we can see. But the other thing is that I don't know that a lot of people pay attention to, and that is the teaching them to obey all that I've commanded you part, right? Jesus, especially, it's the most Jewish gospel in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus talks about Torah and how not one jot or tittle of Torah will pass away. So literally, he's saying, I teach the nations Jewish particularity, a Jewish way of being religious, right? So I'm disavowing any colonial sort of impulse that may come from that, for sure. And I think that's it's an important difference that we need to, a complication that's happened since that these words were first put down. And we need to recognize and account for in our teaching. No, conquest bad.
Conquest bad.
Let's not do that.
Let's not do that at all. Conquest bad. But on the other hand, like there's an impulse, not so much anymore. I don't think it's so much anymore, but do you sometimes get it, if quite honestly, in Christian circles, why can't we all just be the same? Why can't we? I don't want to see you as Black. I don't want to see you as, in your particularity. I kind of want to see you as human. And that's not what's going on here. Right? Jesus is actually saying, no, my Jewish particularity is still what I'm out there teaching. And I'm out there, sort of talking about and showing the winsomeness of when I talk to the other. So that teaches me, for someone who is often sort of the price of entering white spaces, sometimes is trying to be less Black, right? Like that's sort of what the assimilationist ideal has been, the melting pot ideal in U.S. culture. I mean, that is enormously empowering to me. It is to say, no, God does not require that of me. I am to be in all of my historical complexity and particularity, and take the values of the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospel of Matthew and engage those through my own particular history and social life.
Wow, that's beautiful.
That really is. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sure that we could do another part or 2 or 3. This is just an enormous topic. But just thank you so much for the wisdom and the insight into these texts and into the question. Just really appreciate you being here, Love.
Oh, yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Love.
And to those of you who are with us, either watching on YouTube or who are listening on your favorite podcast app, thank you for being here as well. You can get more resources, reflections, podcast episodes, videos, commentaries, courses, all kinds of things at enterthebible.org. And of course, rate and review us on your favorite podcast app, or like and subscribe on the YouTubes. Share with a friend. It really does help us get the word out about this program. We appreciate you so much. Until next time.